has an opinion of Florida. You know what I mean. A preconceived notion, a judgment, a really ridiculous image involving a mullet, a moped, and an alligator. The internet supports this because we all know you should trust the internet. Truthfully, I'm not much of an internet surfer. I prefer the time-tested forming of opinions by experience. So when Jodi told me that we were going to Florida to interview a subject for a story, I had a lot of ideas about what that could look like. What I really didn't expect was something transformative, something that makes you start to really contemplate wind direction, tide charts, and which jetty the snooker laid up on, almost every time you close your eyes to sleep. And in a grand way, it becomes a life practice. Florida, host to some of the world's wildest inhabitants. And yes, that includes those folks with mullets. Living in Spain, I often introduce myself as Samuel. Gresham doesn't seem to roll off the tongue over here. But when I met Steve Lamb, I said, "Hi, Gresham." He discarded that information immediately, and I began to go by a whole host of names: Kingfisher, Cash, you, Franklin. I'd soon learned that Steve operates on a malleable plane where people exist in non-specific decades and names come to represent who you are as a person. Somewhere in Steve's aqueous mind, I came to represent fishing and money. Around the time that we began shooting the documentary, I was short on both of these things. Jodi and I were living in Atlanta. I couldn't be driving home to Athens to be fishing all the time. I was trying to play music, record scores, and write. And that famous triptych was far from lucrative. So after our first trip to Florida, I realized that a fishing pole was often an essential item for a shoot, and money would only lead to problems in prison. Jodi and I differ explicitly in our writing styles. Jodi is a fantastic listener. People unload on her. And then she crafts a beautiful story. I am capable of listening. People unload on me. And then I create a fiction around the most startling bits of their story. But when it comes to listening to Steve Lamb narrate his own life, Jodi's patience and charm weigh heavily.
This isn't a step. Let me see a form. I'm gonna be a fat dude. Give me some more now. All right, where are we headed now?
Steve would use his famous one-liners liberally. Jodi would listen, and I would drive.
I just saw an alligator. It's my word. Okay. How about a right here?
One of my main roles in producing the film was navigating St. Pete Beach. Often this meant translating Steve's murmured mention of a place where money was buried or remembering a specific creek where the smugglers would offload on a mangrove island.
Okay, we're in Bunce's Pass. It's a place where we used to unload square grouper. In other words, marijuana. And we would unload tons of it.
More often than not, I was simply bringing Steve closer to our crew by being able to talk about boats, fishing, and hunting. When we weren't following Steve's story through small streets in St. Petersburg, I was back in Atlanta making minimum wage on a brewery line or painting houses. When I was lucky, I was scoring short films for Ethan, and often I was just recording. But my band Oak House had recently parted ways amicably, and I needed a place to dispel my creative energy. The surf, sand, and solitude lingered on the back of my mind. And I began composing piecemeal one of my largest bodies of work, the Green Flash soundtrack. But again, years before that would become a reality, I was on the beach at sunset waiting for the perfect shot of Steve rummaging through dead fish after a red tide. Or simply staring, intently expecting that mysterious green flash to appear, following the setting sun into the Gulf of Mexico. Like I said, people open up to me. And sometimes that means participating to earn trust. I'm trying to wink, but I'm not much of a winker. Needless to say, Steve and the network of smugglers had really opened my eyes to the horrors of drug addiction. Wink. But after months of filming in Florida, I started to recognize all the green that God had given us as beautiful. If you catch my drift, double wink.
Laughter is a comedian. The laughter is a comedian. The laughter is a comedian. Jokes. The laughter is a comedian. The laughter is a comedian. The laughter is a comedian. Dow Jones, the man who lives in a hole. Dow Jones.
But something about that flash, that frequent nightmare of a wave bigger than you're ready to catch cresting just overhead, and you gotta dig in and take it. The ubiquitous saltiness of life really started to affect me. A wholesale conversion. Fish became dreams and reality. Jamaica became a place one could travel to on a boat with the intention of turning around and changing your whole life. A whole world of smuggling is implied in business across every beach in Florida. It's all there, and I'm not even sure people take it seriously when they arrive for a 1-week vacation. Spend some time fishing on the jetties and the creeks on the flats from a kayak, and you start to realize that growing up in Florida is essentially nautical training for a life of adventure and danger. And once Steve's network of smugglers and friends started to open up to us, I realized that more than one old man hobbling down Ocean Boulevard had likely done something very illegal in their life at least once. For others, it was becoming clear that it was a lifestyle, an unavoidable economic allure for the sons of fishermen who had an unstable economy and soaring energy prices waiting for them in the working world, and that for those who escaped Vietnam with their youth. The beauty of working with Jodi and Ethan is that they are both patient with extracting these stories.
Now, we hear you're the queen of 77th Avenue and St. Pete Beach, is that right? Have you ever been there?
After multiple interviews with Steve, I didn't think we would get anywhere. He meandered, he misled, he misquoted. Fortunately, they had already had a productive series of interviews with Jake as a part of the crew. The bedrock of our film was being formed, and the rabbit trails that Steve's mind followed were simply opportunities to catch one new detail and run with it. We'd driven around in our big blue van with Steve in the back seat, pointing out friends' houses, gators and ditches, and hidden treasure locations. As in Steve's many millions buried around St. Pete in coolers sealed in polyethylene. Hell, we didn't know what was true. But as more bitter old men started coming out with their version of the story, we realized that Hubbard's Pier, the condos, the whole stinking infrastructure of Florida was built on dirty money. How to corroborate the story became the challenge. Steve, God bless his soul, was smart as hell. He knew how to fix a 2-stroke and a 4-stroke. He could tie fishing knots that have no names. He knew what clouds mean that the snook are laid up in the rocks, which tides, winds, and storms bring the best waves. He knew how to clean a hog grouper and a white-tailed deer. Which kind of bribe was necessary for a Florida cop or a Venezuelan cop? The man knew a lot. but it was never quite obvious that Steve was a veritable encyclopedia of practical knowledge.
You know the water's crystal clear, Kevin. The snooker laid up against the wall.
And among those who did know were many bitter old men who seemed downright jealous of Steve's intelligence and swagger. People would often dismiss Steve's voluminous knowledge and highlight how quirky and inconsistent he was. He's washed up, a drug addict, they say. Have you met him yet, they'd ask. But when you see a man stare at the sunset like he did, you start to believe he may have seen something that the majority of men will never see.
I'd like to take a moment to tell you about our partners, Last Prisoner Project. The Last Prisoner Project is a nonprofit organization dedicated to cannabis-related criminal justice reform. As the United States moves away from the criminalization of cannabis, giving rise to a major new industry, there remains the fundamental injustice inflicted upon those who have suffered under America's unjust policy of cannabis prohibition. Through intervention, advocacy, and awareness campaigns, the Last Prisoner Project works to redress the past and continuing harms of these inhumane and ineffective laws and policies. We're using our film, The Green Flash, and this podcast to help the Last Prisoner Project raise money and awareness. Visit www.lastprisonerproject.org or text FREEDOM to 24365 to donate and learn more. Now, back to the episode.
In their search for a fuller story, Jodi and Ethan seem to find themselves shaking hands with the wrong men. Steve couldn't be our only source, I get it. But somehow, if I managed to miss a shoot, Jodi would come home telling me that Ethan had made a handshake deal with a potentially dangerous person. And let's be clear, many of the men whom we were dealing with had histories of their own, some absurd, others violent. But in those histories was where those men still lived. Once your pot smuggling days end and you end up selling waterbeds in the Keys, I'm sure there's a certain necessity to reconnect with your rumored days of adventure.
Real quick here, Ethan, co-director, feel like I need to defend myself a little bit.
Oh, I will say, it's very funny, and he's just teasing, but he mentions that there were multiple times that I made handshake deals with smugglers. And let me just say, for the record, let's just set the record straight. It was one time. On our very first shoot. I didn't know what I was doing, and it was only once.
And also, the conditions were, the handshake deal was that if that person was to be involved, that they would be a producer, and we just opted not to involve them.
That's very true.
No, you have not broken your word.
I don't think so either.
Oh, but that is what happens when you and I
deservedly got a lot of grief for that, and I deserved it. And so we.
That's when Gresham became a fixer on top of being a navigator, hunter, fisher, gatherer, composer, producer,
key grip,
fixer, key grip,
sound mixer, driver, teamster captain, and you said all the other hunter-gatherer things.
CFO, yeah.
Cook.
Yeah.
Ethan here, just taking a quick second to let y'all know about some friends of ours, Look Alive Coffee. Look Alive is a small batch coffee roaster out of St. Pete, Florida. They make fresh, seasonal coffees to fuel whatever you're working on. Whether it's a painting, a playlist, your favorite book, or a podcast based on a film, they're here to keep you energized and inspired. You can find them at lookalivecoffee.com. Now back to the show.
It was evident from the get-go that we'd need more than a group of old men talking about themselves. Steve sure did seem to love his family, and that's documentary making. You get to know someone, you form a friendship, and then they say, "Let's go by my daughter's house." Steve had regularly been referring to his twin daughters. He liked to use a variable set of criteria for telling them apart, most of which I won't mention here. But often it was something like, one's a cop and the other one's married to Rob. We all have the experience of meeting people, learning about their lives, and then maintaining a friendship that runs distinct from this other life. But one day, we were on our way over to Rob and Gigi's house. And let's be clear here, Steve was a ripped man in his day, an athlete, a diver, a fighter. He was busted with tons of pot, some 15 tons, depending on whether you're talking about it all getting off the shrimp boat. So meeting his kids was a little frightening. His twins had both avoided the life of crime and started their adult lives in the National Guard. I imagine them being athletes too. And this Rob guy, surely horrific. So one day we're pulling into their driveway, an unassuming Florida ranch house with wandering live oaks overhead. An old yellow Spanish fishing boat in the yard and a lot of curiosity about who lived in there. After a brief freeze phase, only a second surely, Gigi and Rob welcomed us into their house. I think they could easily see that Steve trusted us, but also we were young and chill. And Steve told them that some high school girl was making a movie about him. Gigi, Rob, Jodi, and I talked about Playa Negra, a black sand beach on the Caribbean side of Costa Rica where Jodi and I had lived for 6 weeks in 2017. We talked about life in Florida. Their living room was lined with surfboards and photos of epic waves. I started to recognize a life I could imagine living. These were people that I wanted to hang out with. And we would, but first things first. How long was Steve in La Jolla? Where did your dad meet Jill? Do you remember when you were a child in Venezuela?
When we met Rob and Gigi and we realized that, oh, Steve's a grandpa, that maybe subconsciously really hit us. And we were like, oh no, Steve's a grandpa. He's not just a scattered dude who's wandering the earth trying to schlep his story around. He's a grandpa. He's beloved by his family.
Right. And his family was such a driving part of his story, and that's something that we discovered. And now looking back at those first interviews and even first times we met Steve, I remember that he was always talking about his family, and he was talking about his mom and his sister, and he was always referring to Jill, I think, as his wife, though she is his ex-wife, and his kids. It was all clearly so important. He was answering phone calls from Bo and then would tell us about him, or he'd be going to pick Bo up, whatever. And so it was obviously very central and important to him. And then when we actually witnessed him being a grandpa, I think he just became so much more human to us and made the whole story much more interesting.
Steve's high adventure story was quickly becoming one of family, Florida, and legacy. And that was a joy for me. I didn't want to make another Scorsese-style drug film loaded with Rolling Stones and classic drug hits. Although we'd learned that Steve was the Stones' personal West Coast of Florida dealer and that Jimmy Buffett was never far from the family tree of Florida smugglers. For me, as the undercover composer, I was beginning to hear themes, motifs, connective tissue in a story that meant more than drugs. There was also a deep sense of obligation, family, and trauma. But we'd come to learn that story more and more over the years filming there. At first, we were following part 1 of Steve's story, the outline provided in his book, The Smuggler's Ghost. Ethan wanted to unearth Steve's relationship with God, his obsession with the grouper sandwich. Jodi wanted to learn more about Steve's relationship with Jill, the details of how he came to be in Venezuela. But we were still operating with only a strong sense of the story from Steve's book. The Steinhatchee 7 was the first hit record for Steve and his buddies. Everyone in the area seemed to know something about it.
Steinhatchee.
From the genesis of the Green Flash, we knew something important had happened in the sawgrass off the northwest coast of Florida. It was in the book, but as the gravity of just what it means to load a 72 Desco with 15 tons of pot on the coast of Jamaica, and then to unload that with 9 people in Florida only days later, was starting to be felt more and more.
Customs officials say they have seized in Florida more than 9 tons of marijuana, what they call the largest marijuana haul ever in the United States. The marijuana, apparently from Jamaica, brought in by boat, valued at more than $4.5 million, is found in some 400 large bags.
This was the bus that made them famous. This was the event in Steve Lamb's life that would send him off to Venezuela after a brief stint in prison. This was that Genesis moment where a young man's whole life starts to become clear to him and to everybody else. Mike Knight with his headband and handgun, Bubba Capo and his backwoods shrimping buddies, a source called Boobs and a line of Jamaicans loading boat after boat, cops paid off, the future all money and adventure. Former DEA agent Charlie Fuss clarified that going through the Yucatan Channel or crossing the tongue of the ocean in a small boat was no insignificant feat. Steve talked about it like it was a run to the grocery store. As we stood in the sawgrass at Steinhatchee with Ethan's drone roaming the inlet, all that strategy, energy, and effort started to become clearer to us. The sun set there just the same, but a green flash was occluded by red flashing lights and a mounting war on drugs. And a young man's life began an unbelievable journey that we were increasingly thrilled to be capturing.
Flash is a podcast written and produced by
Ethan Payne,
Gresham Cash,
and Jodi Cash. It features an original score and sound design by Gresham Cash. We made this podcast to support the premiere of our first feature-length film, The Green Flash. This August, we're taking The Green Flash on tour throughout Florida and Georgia. We'll host screenings and special events at independent theaters from St. Pete Beach to Key West to St. Augustine, before we bring it home to Athens and Atlanta. For more updates, follow us on Instagram and TikTok at The Green Flash Documentary, and sign up for our newsletter at www.thegreenflashdocumentary.com. Thank you so much for listening to Looking for the Green Flash. We'll be back with another episode next Monday. We'll see you in the movies.